Hey, what's going on, guys? I know people seem to like my goat content, so I decided to make a little something today. And this is my top 8 misunderstood cards in Go format. So I'm not saying that these cards are like overrated or that they're underrated. Just that I think people are like playing them in wrong ways or are misunderstanding the way that they're supposed to be used. So I'm going to go ahead and get started with my number 8, which is Compulsory Evacuation Device. And the reason that this is on my list is basically because no one is really talking about this card, and I think people should. I think it should be considered as a viable option. So um, it's caught on a little because like it stops Nobleman across out and Mind Control, and they're not like a lot of cards that really do that in the format. So, there's like Spell Shield Type 8, but there's also the fact that Compulsory Evacuation Device is probably the best counter in the game to Metamorphosis, right? For Thousand Eyes, because if they meta to Thousand Eyes and like you book it, they can just meta for another Thousand Eyes, or even if they don't, like it puts a Dark in their grave if they're playing Chaos. Whereas Compulsory Evacuation Device, since it sends it back to the deck, or the fusion deck, there's nothing they can really do about it, right? They can't just like meta again. It's not going to their graves. They're not getting their dark. So as a counter to Thousand Eyes, it's actually better than Book of Moon. And the way that people should be considering this, I think, is like as a side deck in Chaos, because a lot of people side Mind Control against Chaos, so like it counters that. And some of these like Chaos decks are like playing like 3 Magician of Face and 3 Dekochis, so like Stop and Cross, that's kind of good too. And like I said, it stops Metamorphosis as well. So in that deck, I think it's something worth considering. Also worthy of note is that like it's pretty good against Empty Jar, because like if they set a jar and go to Book a Teyuit, you can compulse and response and like their turn's over. So that's like kind of good. It's not like insane against Empty Jar or anything. And it also worth noting like Compulsory Evacuation Device also very good with Breaker in a way that like Book of Moon isn't. You can like break their face down, compulse it, and then break another face down. So it just makes Breaker like a safer play in general. And as far as the bad goes, I think really the main reason that people aren't thinking about this is the fact that, well, this is just a worse Book of Moon. And certainly in some decks, that is the case. Like in my Angel Chaos deck, I play 3 Book of Moon, no Compulse, because Book is really good with Shining Angel and Compulse, like, not so much. Um, so I'm not saying like everyone should start playing this. Obviously, there's the fact that even though it does counter cross out, it's kind of like a negative tempo play because now you have to like set your monster again, and the normal summon is a very important resource in Goat format. So again, not saying that everyone should start playing this, but I think it's worth a look, and no one's really talking about it. So, Magical Merchant is an interesting card to talk about, and that's because a lot of people say Magical Merchant is good in Goat Control and bad in Chaos, and like I kind of think it's more of the opposite. So obviously, everyone knows that Magical Merchant is a level 1 light monster, right? That's how it caught on. Chris Perovic started playing it in Goat Control, and his logic is, well, like I wanted to, play 3 Metamorphosis. I needed some more level 1s. Merchant was the best option. The fact that it's like a light monster for BLS, even better, right? And of course, he was also playing 2 Tsukiyomis in his Goat Control deck, a choice that's now standard. He's like, look, combos with Tsukiyomi. Hey, I might even mill a Sinister. What could go wrong, right? And that was like how it first started getting played. So people, I think, got this idea in their head of, Magical Merchant is a Goat Control card. This is a card that every Goat Control deck should be playing. Whereas, in my opinion, I think where it really shines is in Chaos decks, because if Magical Merchant mills a bunch of lights and darks, that can just totally change the game. And people say that, oh, well, since you're playing 3 Chaos monsters, 3 or 4 Chaos monsters, well, that means you're more likely to mill one with Merchant. And that's true, but that's not bad. Because what people don't realize is that in Goat Control, if your Magical Merchant mills your BLS, that is like huge. That is like totally changing the entire way this game is going to be played out. Because Goat Control only plays one BLS, obviously, no Chaos Sorcerers. Whereas in a Chaos deck, you can afford to mill like one Chaos Monster, right? So like if my Magical Merchant mills my Chaos Sorcerer, I'm actually happy about that because now I have a light and a dark in my grave. So if I draw another Chaos Sorcerer later on, I know I'll be able to summon it. And the reason that I think people should maybe like reconsider this card in Goat Control is the fact that there are other options, right? Like, okay, it's the only like good level 1 light that Goat Control can play, but maybe you don't necessarily need a level 1 light, right? Obviously, if you're really determined to play 3 Metamorphosis, I definitely think there needs to be some Magical Merchants in your deck. But maybe consider their choices. Metamorphosis isn't nearly as good as it used to be. So I think this isn't really as much of a slam dunk in Goat Control as it used to be, whereas I think it's one of the most important cards in Chaos, and that is why Magical Merchant is number 7 on my list. Number 6 is Morphing Jar, and Morphing Jar, when you ask people about this card, you can kind of like hear things on all parts of the spectrum. There's some people who think, oh my god, this card is like, the fourth Trinity piece, it's broken. And then there's some people who are like, oh yeah, Morphing Jar, like that card's terrible. Why would anyone play it? And that's because, like, it can really be either one. It can be broken and it can be terrible. And a lot of it is about, like, how you play it and what kind of deck you're playing it in. So in Goat Control, I think Morphing Jar is pretty good, right? If you look at the downsides, obviously the fact that it's not a light or a dark, that doesn't really matter in Goat Control because you're only playing just your one BLS. You're not so concerned with that. And Goat Control, I think, really kind of needs like some high variance cards like Morphing Jar. That's just kind of the deck that it is. I think it really often needs a card like Morphing Jar to help get itself back in the game. Also, you'll notice that Morphing Jar has synergy with Dust Tornado, and the reason that I say that is because with Dust Tornado's second effect, you can use it to set a spell or a trap from your hand so you don't lose it to your Morphing, and Goat Control is typically playing 2 Dust Tornadoes. And there's also just the fact that, if your opponent knows you're playing Morphing Jar, they have to play around it even when you don't have it. And I think that is like kind of the underrated aspect of Morphing Jar that people like don't talk about enough. Yes, like obviously the insane Morphing Jar where you just get, 5 cards from their hand and like 1 card from yours. That's great. But sometimes you won't have Morphing Jar there, but your opponent still has to play around it. So, it might ban out a cross out, it might force your opponent to do some really awkward plays, and I think in many cases that's the value had from it. On the other hand, though, there's obviously the fact that sometimes you Morphing Jar, get a bunch of card advantage with it, and then your opponent just resets it with their Book of Moon or Tsukiyomi, and then just does the same thing back to you. And that can be hard, right? Sometimes they even have Heavy Storm to go along with it. Like, I've definitely won games that way, where they set their entire hand, Morphing Jar me, and I just go, Heavy Storm you, summon Tsukiyomi, attack your Morphing Jar, and then now the game's back in my favor again. So, it's definitely a high variance card. I think Goat Control is the deck that, like, plays into that kind of strategy better than something like Thunder Dragon Chaos, which is where I see a lot of people playing it. So, to sum this up, I think Morphing Jar is underrated in Goat Control, and I think it's overrated in Chaos. So that's why Morphing Jar made the list. So, Solemn Judgment is, I'll give people some credit. A couple of years ago, I think the Goat format was just oversaturated with this card. People were just playing it in like any deck, and they just didn't realize the downsides to the card. Whereas I think now, I for the most part, I only see people playing it in decks where it's warranted. But there are some exceptions, which is why it's on my list. So, why do we play Solemn? First of all, the card is probably one of the best cards you could have in the late game. If there was some magical guarantee that I could stack my deck in such a way that Solemn Judgment would always be in the bottom 20 cards of my deck, I would play Solemn Judgment in every deck, because it's just really, really good in the late game. One of the decks that plays it a lot is sort of the Tsukiyomi Mask of Darkness deck, and that's because you can just counter all their cards, right? It feels like you're playing Magic the Gathering. You just go counterspell, counterspell, counterspell. And it's really good there. It's really good in any deck that's setting a lot of back rows, which like some aggro decks kind of do as well, like some sort of like King Tiger Wangu type of deck. Som's good pretty there because you're just going so aggro and you're not really so concerned with your own life points. But obviously, paying 4,000 to negate something is pretty huge, and like it can't be understated. A few years ago, I think people were playing Solemn Judgment because they didn't realize how important life points were in GOAT control. In around 2012, when the GOAT format sort of saw its revival, it was kind of marketed as, hey, this is a format where like card advantage is the most important thing. But like in reality, life points are really important too. So that's why you still see some people who just think that Solemn Judgment is like some, underrated like 3-of staple in GOAT format because, oh my god, it negates anything. But in reality, the life points are key. So in a deck where you don't care about your own life points very much, like a Mask of Darkness deck or an aggro deck, Solemn Judgment's great. Otherwise, don't play it, right? It used to be the case that you'd see like some Thunder Dragon type of decks playing it, and I don't think it's very good there, but I think they've wisened up for the most part. So, my number 4 is Trap Dustshoot. And to this day, I still see people siding in this card when they really shouldn't be. There's this myth in GOAT format, I think, that like you should side this in when you're going first, like against just any deck. And I think that's really not the case, because it's not the kind of card where if you open it, you just win the game. And Trap Dustshoot specifically, it's very good in the early game if you're combining it with pressure, right? So if you Dustshoot your opponent and just kind of do nothing for the next 5 turns, that's not a very good Dustshoot, because you haven't really capitalized on what makes Dustshoot so good, which is that you're sending back one of the best cards in their hand, and now you know their entire hand. But like if you just kind of sit there and don't do anything, then like that advantage just sort of slowly melts away. So in aggro decks, Dustshoot can be pretty good, either in the main or the side deck. In a control deck, like in GOAT control, I would not include this in my main deck or my side deck. And that's because obviously it's a potential dead card. You don't want to like give your opponent a million turns to kind of like draw out of the bad spot that they're in. So in other words, when you look at when Dustshoot started seeing play in Yu-Gi-Oh!, it was about like sort of mid-2007. And that's not a coincidence. Dustshoot is really good in matchups where the game is going to be over quickly, because you could just Dustshoot them, take away their best card, and then kill them within the next few turns. If you're not doing that, Dustshoot is just a situational 1-for-1, and that's all it is. So that's why Dustshoot's number 4 on my list, because people I think misunderstand the circumstances that make Dustshoot a good card, and that is when the game is going to end quickly. So Scapegoat is a very interesting card that I think a lot of people don't talk about enough, and we all know why Scapegoat is good. I think stops OTKs, right? You can, if your life points are getting low, you can use it to buy yourself some time. Obviously, it has great synergy with Metamorphosis, as we all know, but also with Creature Swap and United We Stand. But on the other hand, the reason why Scapegoat, I think, isn't nearly as popular as it used to be is because of the fact that it doesn't really like answer any threats by itself, right? So your opponent attacks the monster, you Scapegoat, but that hasn't changed the fact that your opponent still has a monster in play. And there's kind of the fact that it's interesting. In 2005, Scapegoat was kind of like this all-encompassing like anti-aggro card, right? Like, it stops Berserk Gorilla, DD Assailant, Vampire Lord, that sort of thing. But like those cards aren't really popular today. And now aggro is playing cards like King Tiger Wangu or Enraged Battle Ox or something along those lines, or Azura Priest. Like, aggro is very prepared for this card. So Scapegoat isn't really sort of like the anti-aggro card that it used to be. Now it's kind of like the anti-OTK card. So, the question that people should be asking, I think, is how many scapegoats should I be playing? And the answer to that question, in my opinion, is you should be playing the number of scapegoats that your opponent doesn't expect you to play. And let me clarify what I mean by that. So, a friend of mine, he was playing against Chris Perovic online recently, and Chris Perovic was the kind of guy who pioneered the 2 scapegoat, 3 metamorphosis lineup in Goat Control. So this guy, he's playing against Chris Perovic, and he checks his grave, sees that 2 scapegoats are in there. This is a couple weeks ago, right? And he goes, okay, Chris, he's used his 2 goats. I'm gonna Heavy Storm and go for game. And then Chris changed the 3rd scapegoat, and him sort of knowing that hey, everyone thinks I'm playing 2 goats, so I'm just gonna start playing 3. That is absolutely brilliant, and that is the type of thing that people should be doing. If people think you're playing 3 goats, side 1 out. If people think you're playing 2 goats, side the 3rd in. If people think you're playing 0 goats, maybe main deck 1, and when they see 1, it kind of opens this can of worms as to, wait, is this guy playing 1 goat, 2, 3? They don't know. So, I actually really like it as a one-of in a deck like Thunder Dragon Chaos, because it is the kind of deck that's trying to buy time and traditionally doesn't play any scapegoats. And because of that, playing it as a random one-of could be good. And in Goat Control right now, I actually really like playing 3 scapegoat instead of 2, because everyone is kind of everyone else is on 2 goats, therefore kind of going against the grain can be good. And then when everyone starts playing 3 goats again, I think you should probably go back to playing 2. So that's what makes Scapegoat good. The best Scapegoat is a scapegoat that your opponent doesn't expect. And, again, it's also the type of card where your opponent will have to play around it even when you don't have it. So it's a great insurance policy against OTKs. It's great against the Reasoning Monster Gate decks. And it can be good in Goat Control mirrors, because Goat Control mirrors can often come down to who's trying to set up a kill turn first. So Scapegoat, I think it's something that people need to stop being lazy and copying everyone else's lists and figure out for themselves, hey, is my deck a 1 scapegoat deck? Is it a 2 scapegoat deck? Is it a 3? Is it a 0? People need to think for themselves, because it's not a black and white answer. It's highly dependent on the meta. Number 2, Thunder Dragon. Obviously, everyone knows I'm going to put this on my list. I of course, how should I say this? I used to be on the anti-Thunder Dragon train. I was telling people that this card is awful, and you're an idiot if you play it. I have since softened up my view on the card, right? And I'll tell you one reason why I've softened up my view on the card, and that is because Thunder Dragon is really, really good with card destruction. So a lot of the earlier sort of Thunder Dragon Chaos decks, they were playing they had some really weird choices. A lot of them were playing Thunder Dragons with not really much to go with it. They were kind of playing Scapegoats and Metamorphoses, and it was kind of hey, I'm gonna play a Goat Control deck, but I'm gonna throw in some Thunder Dragons and Chaos Sorcerer, and I railed against these people. I'm your Thunder Dragon is never going to do anything because you don't have anything that has synergy with it, right? But today, the Thunder Dragon Chaos decks have gotten a lot better. And that is because people have realized that this is a build-around card. This is not a card that you can just throw into any deck with Chaos Sorcerer and expect it to be good. Because, discarding a Thunder Dragon and searching 2 more, by itself doesn't really do anything. You have to combine it with some sort of discard outlets. So now what you see Thunder Dragon Chaos decks doing is playing card destruction, Night Assailant, and then other discard. And it's kind of hey, I'm playing a Chaos deck, but my sub-theme is that I have all these great cards to discard to my card destructions, my Graceful Charities, my my Tribe Infecting Virus, my Phoenix Windblast, my Raigeki Break, and so on and so forth. And obviously it also protects them against duo. So what you really got to understand is that Thunder Dragon is a build-around card, right? I know I've probably said that 3 times by now, but what I was telling people back when they were playing Thunder Dragon wrong, I said, take notes on every time you have Thunder Dragon and whether or not it did anything. And what people found is that it didn't do a whole lot very often. It just kind of sat in their hand for the whole game. And that's what you want to avoid. So make sure that when you're playing this card, it doesn't sit in your hand the whole game. That's the key. Um, and if it is, realize that there are other choices for lights and chaos, right? You could play, of course, Shining Angel, but also like Blade Knight, Skilled White Magician. Thunder Dragon isn't the only game in town as far as lights go. So last on my list is Metamorphosis, and I know this is gonna seem weird to people, but this is another card that I think people need to be talking about more. And again, I think a lot of the GOAT players are getting lazy. Um, a few years ago, Chris Perovic, he really revolutionized the game with his 2 Scapegoat, 3 Metamorphosis GOAT control, and he had a pretty simple theory at the time, and that was Metamorphosis is great in GOAT mirrors. Everyone else is playing 2 of this card, so I'm going to play 3, and I'm going to win the GOAT mirror because of it. And that was a pretty good theory at the time. But things have changed a bit. Instead of playing cards like Exarian Universe, typically now GOAT Control is played with no Exarians, and now you see GOAT Control playing cards like Azura Priest as their aggressive option, which Metamorphosis doesn't stop. And then they're just kind of playing like a lot of flip effects. And, Metamorphosis, it's very good against face-up monsters, right? If your opponent summons a monster and attacks you with it, and you go Scapegoat to block the hit and Metamorphosis, and then take their guy and then start hitting them with it, that's great. On the other hand, if you take, like, a face-down monster, unless you have, like, a Tsukiyomi to loop it, or you contribute it for Air Knight, your opponent can just sit there and do nothing. And that tends to be pretty bad. So, what you see nowadays is that a lot of people are playing 3 Book of Moons. A lot of people are playing 2 Tsukiyomis. A lot of people are playing Compulsory Evacuation. Okay, not a lot of people are playing Compulsory, but some people are playing Compulsory. A lot of people are playing, like Raigeki Breaker, Phoenix Windblast in their Chaos decks. Chaos Sorcerer's obviously a great out to Thousand Eyes. So, like, what you'll see is that a lot of these Chaos decks are just very, very prepared to deal with Metamorphosis. You can bring out as many Thousand Eyes restricts as you want, and they're just going to answer it with either their Chaos Sorcerer, their Tsukiyomi, or they're just going to book it, or they're going to Raigeki break it, or something. And it's just a different game. What people have kind of realized is that if your deck can't beat Thousand Eyes Restrict, it's just not a viable deck. I mean, that's just the fact. So in that kind of meta, I think people need to like start rethinking this card because obviously it has potential to be dead, and realize that it can be a -1. Like, people don't realize this. No one talks about that. But if you go set Magical Merchant, right? I'm going to Metamorphosis my Magical Merchant, try to take your guy, and they book it and then run over your set Thousand Eyes, that is a 2-for-1 trade. They just traded their Book of Moon for your meta and your Magical Merchant. And, that's really something to think about. Now, of course, Metamorphosis, I, of course, still play 3 Metamorphosis in, like, my Angel Chaos deck, but that's because, like, every single thing is a level 1 target, right? Like, I'm playing Merchant, Faith, Scapegoat, and Shining Angel, which can search level 1s. But, in GOAT Control, yeah, having the 3rd meta is probably good in the mirror, but the metagame has shifted a bit, right? And it's not, like, as good against Chaos as it is against the mirror. And even in the mirror, people are playing, like, 3 Spirit Monsters and a bunch of flip effects. So, like, what are you even hoping to take, right? You're basically saying, either I'm going to hope to, like, take their Air Knight after it's probably already hit you, which isn't good. Maybe I'll take, like, a set monster and then loop it with Tsukiyomi. Maybe I'll take their set monster and then tribute it for Air Knight. What people have to realize is that, Metamorphosis, it is a situational card, so it cannot just sort of be blindly thrown into any deck. And it's not something that... It used to be the case that you could just play 3 Metamorphosis and just have a huge advantage over the field. But, like, that is not really the case anymore. Like, the field has evolved, and people are very prepared to deal with metas. So, if you find that meta isn't working out, I would perhaps reconsider your strategy. In goat control, I would consider maybe going back to 2. You can always side the 3rd for decks that it happens to be really good against. Um, but the fact is that it it has high potential to be a dead card, especially if you're one of the people like only playing 2 scapegoats, right? It of course it's very good with Sinister, right? I mean, if you open like Sinister Serpent and a bunch of Metamorphoses, you can definitely win the game off the back of that. But Go Control, like, it's not really as much of a control deck as it used to be. Now it's kind of like set up kill turns type of deck. And I feel that if Goat Control is over reliant on Metamorphosis as their win condition, it just kind of gets crushed by people who are just prepared for that. So yeah, so that's why Metamorphosis is on my list. I also have an honorable mention, and that is Mind Control. I considered putting this on my list because it was very, very overrated a few months ago, but ultimately decided not to put it on my list because I think most people now are playing it appropriately. But to summarize kind of the history of Mind Control, about a year ago or so, there was sort of this worry that like Chaos was like too good. Various Chaos decks were kind of like dominating the online field, whether it was Thunder Dragon Chaos, Angel Chaos, Recruiter Chaos. But obviously Thunder Dragon Chaos has always been the most popular variant, and people were like, okay, what can I side against Thunder Dragon Chaos that's really good? And I don't know who. I'm sure someone in the comments tried to take credit for this, but someone came up with Mind Control. It was a pretty ingenious choice because it does a few things. You can use it to take their Chaos Monster and use its effect to banish itself, which is really strong because, if they play like Premature Call, they can't bring it back. Something like Book of Moon can't answer it. And then they realized, well, Thunder Dragon Chaos also plays a bunch of flip effects. So I can, like, mind control their set to Kochi and then, like, flip it up and draw a card and then pass it back to them, which was also pretty good. But then I think people, like, took it too far and, like, started, like, kind of siding it against everything, which isn't what you want to be doing. This isn't the type of card that you want to, like, bring in against Go Control because it has a strong potential to go wrong, right? And even against Thunder Dragon Chaos, sometimes you'll mind control their set monster and they'll say, hey, it's a Sangan. And then you kind of just have to pass it back and say go. And what also people don't realize is that if your opponent has a Tsukiyomi, mind control isn't that great, right? Because if you just like take their Dakochi, flip it up and pass it back, they can just still Tsukiyomi it and draw another card. Particularly against like the Tsukiyomi decks that like loop like Mask of Darkness and stuff, mind control isn't very good against that. Because it's like, okay, you like mind control their set mask, get back a random trap, and then you just pass it back, and then they just Tsukiyomi it and get back their Solemn Judgment or whatever. So, it is very good against a very specific type of deck, and that is the Chaos deck that plays a lot of flip effects, but it has a high potential to go wrong and should not be cited in lightly. But for the most part, I don't think people are doing that too much anymore. So yeah, that's all for today. Let me know if you enjoyed this type of video or if you disagreed with my choices. The reason I did this is because, like I said, I think a lot of GOAT players are lazy. I think the format has gotten kind of stagnant, and I think people like aren't really innovating as much anymore and sort of giving things a fresh look. So, whether I'm right or wrong on these cards, I think it's at least worth talking about whether, these cards that people had kind of taken for granted as being good, if they're still good as the meta continues to evolve. So yeah, thanks for watching, guys.